everyone. Joe is recording this session, and I think everybody is here, so we'll just get started. So, welcome. While I am not a public speaker, I am very happy to be here discussing two things that I'm very interested in: Reynolds family history and YDNA. And so thank you all for joining us. We're going to have an interesting discussion. I'm Tommy Joe Reynolds, and I've been a genealogist for about 10 years, and I've been into genetic genealogy for about 5 years, and involved with the Reynolds family YDNA project for about a year. I'll be going through this, actually, a series of 3 presentations. We'll split them up a little bit to give people breaks and chance to ask questions, etc. But if you have questions during the middle of the discussion, feel free, shout them out, raise your hand, we'll address them as they come up. So, all right, let's get started. First off, I want to introduce you to the YDNA project administrators. There are 4 of us: Joe Reynolds, who you know, Nancy Wallander, who's here with us today. Peggy Reynolds Oliver, she lives in Maine. She was not able to make it, but if you've been involved in the project, you've probably received emails from her. And this is me, Tommy Joe Reynolds. So, overview of our discussion today. My goal is that all of you that attend this or even see the video of this later will come away with an understanding of how you can use DNA research to advance whatever your research goals are with your Reynolds line. Because wherever you are within the project, there are ways to use the tools that are available to get past brick walls and to progress with your research. And we're going to discuss this in 3 primary sections. The first is going to be just a 101, very basic information about the project and basic information about YDNA testing. Second section is going to be on what members can do once you're a member of the project and have submitted a kit. What can you do to optimize your experience and to make the most of the project? We hear a lot of times that people get their results and it's a string of numbers that are indecipherable and mean nothing to the members, so the administrators help work with the project members to go through that. And we'll have some tips on that for you. And finally, one of the most interesting sections, we're going to cover a couple different strategies that you can use when you're in the project to advance your specific research. And we have a couple of case studies to go along with that. This will be broken into sections, and if you have questions, if you want to sit down for some one-on-one feedback, perhaps after you get back from lunch or something like that, before we do some of the other sections, then feel free to talk to me and Nancy, especially about the questions that you have. So if you have a question that you think would pertain to others, feel free to fire it off here. If you have a really, really specific thing about your exact lineage and your results, then it's probably worth a separate sort of one-on-one sit down. Okay, so we'll get started with section 1. Just in a very basic sense, there are certain things that YDNA tests can do for you. They can help validate or invalidate your traditional research. Taking a YDNA test can indicate if Reynolds has been the surname in your family for a long time. Some people get their results back and match no other Reynoldses, but they match lots of Taylors or some other surname. In that case, it's a pretty good indicator that your Y chromosome has not been connected to Reynoldses for very deep into the past. YDNA can show which Reynoldses you are not related to. We'll get into that into some more detail later on. It can help estimate how closely 2 different Reynoldses are related. It can help identify your matches in the time frame of about 200 to 600 years back. And it can even allow you to trace your family history after you run out of named people. You trace your line back, you know, William is the son of John, is the son of blah, 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 blah. Once you run out of names and paper trails, you can now use YDNA markers. Okay, you've gotten it back to William. You don't know the name of his father, but you know the names of the DNA markers that you can keep tracing up, and then connect those to other people that have tested. And we'll show some details about that. A few things that YDNA cannot do. By itself, it cannot identify your ancestors. And in some cases, it can't tell you exactly how two people are related. It can give you good clues, which you can then develop. And another thing, YDNA cannot be tested in females because females do not have Y chromosomes, but females interested in doing this sort of research can be involved by testing their brothers, their male cousins, their fathers, etc. Okay, so I'm gonna show you a picture with the real basic sort of conceptual model of how a YDNA project works. First off, right down here on the bottom, we have several men. We have 1 Reynolds, 2 Reynolds, 3 Reynolds, 4 Reynolds, and we have a couple other people thrown into the mix. And so each of these little yellow blobs down here is a man that has submitted a YDNA test, and they've got their results. So each of these men has done some traditional paper genealogy, and some of them know. Okay, they go back in time, they know the names of their male line ancestors from census data, from land records, from this other traditional genealogical sources. And even before DNA is involved, this Reynolds and this Reynolds know that they trace back to the same great-grandfather. Fine. I think we're all kind of familiar with how this looks from tracing our ancestry lines traditionally. But then we all get to this point, where you can only get back to William or Nathaniel or whoever your ancestor is. And so what YDNA can do is YDNA can pick up. And after you run out of named ancestors, if each of these people tests and do so in a certain way, they will get a chain of YDNA markers that just come in this alphabet soup of numbers that are not, on the face of it, understandable, but they can be used to see. So these aren't the names of men, but if you consider them, if you were to replace this with the name John, for example, then you would understand, okay, this person traces back to John, and these other people trace back to John also. But instead of knowing their actual name, we know the DNA symbol. And so this can show how this Reynolds number 3 and Reynolds number 1 actually relate. They relate to a SNP with this sort of address. Do we have any questions about that? Because that's kind of a fundamental thing about what we're trying to do. Yes.
So that DNA name is a unique.
Yes. Yeah.
Series of numbers and letters and stuff like that.
Yes. Good question. This is a specific address that doesn't exist for anyone that does not descend from this line. So you could.
It's one person. There's one person that it originates from.
Yes, exactly. Each of these markers are they're a symbol of a mutation that happened through along this lineage, and then that is passed down to all of the descendants in that lineage. There'll be a little bit more information about that. But good question.
What are the testers that you're identifying that do these? I mean, like the Ancestry and the WikiTree has got some, and so forth.
Yes.
Who's doing that Y testing?
So the Y testing, in most cases, these would be, the Reynoldses would usually be people that are in the Reynolds project. They may have, when they submit their test, they may have some, for example, this guy would match some Reynoldses, but he would also have some matches with a different surname that are not necessarily in the Reynolds project, but All of the men in the YDNA project, their data is in the family tree DNA database. And our project only operates in the family tree DNA database. Members can all take their data or their SNP addresses, as these little blue box are. They could load it into Wikitree. So if this Reynolds loads his tree into Wikitree, he can choose. The administrators of the project we don't do this for anybody. But if he chooses that he's okay with making his DNA information public in Wikitree, then for example, he could identify that this William Reynolds is connected with this marker.
I'm going the other way. Where do you come up with the testing that you did to put that database together? In other words, are you getting DNA tests from part of the group and that's submitted to you and then you define it?
So all of this would come through family tree DNA. As the administrators of the project get notifications from family tree DNA when a new member has new results, or when a member receives matches to other people. And so this information is fed to the man that is tested through his family tree DNA account, and it's available to administrators to look up in the family tree DNA system.
Is that only if you make it public?
A couple of different things. For the most part, the administrators have access. This is all defined by the user who is tested. But in most cases, the member has given permission to the administrators to view this information. Members can also set it so that the administrators can't view this information, but then what you would be able to get out of the project is extremely limited if this information is not visible to at least your close matches and the administrators. But if there are questions about privacy things, those can be discussed with the administrators also. But the privacy controls are defined by the member who submitted the sample. And the member also decides what information is available on the public website, if any or nothing at all. Does that answer your question?
So there's two things, the public websites and the administrators.
Yes, that's right.
And can you designate which administrators would have access, or is
Yes,
it all
but,
administrators?
no, you can do one by one. You could give one administrator certain access, a different administrator different access. And that's for any of the projects you might join. You can set it one by one.
So if you said for the Reynolds project, only administrators.
Yes, you could set all of the Reynolds administrators to a certain access and all of your other project administrators to less or more based on the okay, so here's the concept. Question for the Reynolds Family Association: where can we take this? What can we do with this sort of as this unique organization of folks interested in studying Reynolds DNA? And one of the most exciting things I think we could do with this is something like this. Most of us are familiar with this, the line chart of the traditional Reynolds progenitors. This is on the website. It's been used for, I don't know, Joe, do you know, 40, 80, 100 years?
It's been over 100 years now.
Yeah, this concept of identifying original progenitors of the Reynolds line in the U.S. And it's been growing. We have some newer ones added down here. We also have some very long established lines. And something we can do with YDNA that I think makes this very exciting is through specific targeted high resolution tests, we can find descendants, male line descendants of some of these folks, and let's see, I think that some of these arrows are not in the right place, so sorry, but you'll get the idea. We can find certain, okay, they are. We can find certain DNA signatures, and that would be like these boxes here. These are key DNA markers that all descendants, all living male descendants of that progenitor should have. And so, for example, the one of these that is very far along the development is my specific line. My ancestor didn't live that far back, just in the mid-19th century. This is nailed down, high confidence, perfect. Anybody that wants to know if they descend from this line could sample this specific marker. We know, yes or no, black or white, whether they descend from Joseph Reynolds. Okay, that's fine. That's the middle of the 19th century. So the bigger challenge, and the more useful challenge, I think, is to find some of our progenitors that are farther back. We're talking in the 1600s that have hundreds of potential descendants, and many researchers looking at these lines. And so we've started to do something with the James line. We'll talk about that in a little bit. On their own, this group has done some testing that we think is giving us the markers of John, probably, Joe, and Angela, and some others in the project group I3 have done some high-resolution testing that is starting to point to a good marker for this progenitor. Something interesting we've found out is that Peggy, one of our administrators, who had her line back to 1755, it turns from her brother's test. Her brother's markers match very, very closely the markers of James. So
at some point you will be able to combine those
yes,
two groups? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And so in that case, based on her research that connects Elisha to some of the descendants of James, she could potentially choose to fold that into one of these older lines. So there may be some cascading of these together.
So how far away are you from, with this information, being able to combine that line 38 to line 14?
Very good question. So you see a question mark here at the end. Basically, there's a marker that it may be a very good single high-resolution marker that indicates all descendants of James. We reached out to Family Tree DNA because they didn't designate this for everybody. The results were mixed for some of the people that tested it. So we reached out to them and said, okay, what do your experts say? Do your experts say this is a high confidence marker or not? We haven't heard back from them yet, but we're gonna keep working with them on that. And you'll see later, but we have 2 pending additional high-resolution big Y tests of this same line. A couple of people saw what we're doing here and were excited and wanted to upgrade their kits. We had a new member and another person. So those results, as more people do high-resolution tests, we get more and more confidence in these signatures, and they move down closer in time. But anyway, that's the sort of high-level concept of what we could potentially do with this. And then we could update this list. So in addition to having, the person's name, their wife's name, where they lived, you could have a comma and then have their YDNA signature. And then someone that thinks they descend from that line could just test those key markers without having to do a high-resolution test and know, yes or no, whether that would work. It's not inexpensive to do this, and you really have to do one line at a time, and it takes a lot of work. Just, I'd say at a minimum, it will probably take 2 big Y tests for each of these lines to have a confident signature. We could have higher confidence if there were 3 or 4 big Y tests for each of these lines, but that's the basic picture.
Do you have DNA for each of the lines, or like, for example, a 12, do you have DNA, anybody in that line at all?
Yep, so good question. What we have within the project, there may be, and we haven't looked at that one, but what we've grouped all the people in the project into certain categories. Some of them in, I don't know, some category, might have traced with confidence back to Robert at Boston, but others might have it back to, I don't know, someone in the 1200s that they say they connect to. Some people might have only gotten to the middle of the 19th century. So we don't have a great, we will only know what these signatures look like as we sort of focus on them one by one.
Can I interject one thing
Yes.
here? Something for all of us to hopefully think about and work on. For example, in my YDNA matches on FamilyTree.com, I've got a total of 94 matches. Of those 94, only 20 of them are members of the Reynolds Family Association. So we may want to each that are members of the YDNA reach out to their people and say, hey, are you a member of the Reynolds Family Association? If not, it's only $20 a year. You know, let's get in, we can work closer together to get more with the lines.
And even in the Reynolds YDNA project, we have almost 300 members just in the project. Most of them are Reynolds named, but other of them are very closely related in any case. And also, we could reach out to each of these and encourage them to join the Reynolds Family Association also.
What do you define as a close relationship?
Good question, and there's a spectrum. The default definition within the Family Tree DNA database, which is where all these tests are stored, they have, they say within 10%. If you test 37 markers, then you can only have 3 or 4 different markers for them to consider you still genetically related. If you tested 111 markers, you can have 10 different markers and they would still consider you genetically related. So it's a spectrum. That's the default criteria for the key database, but administrators will also have more information to make individualized determinations to say, well, you, because there may be specific criteria that would make someone say that they are or not related even outside of those parameters.
Is that typically like a son, grandson, great grandson?
It could be much further back. With STR data, you could have people that connect something like 400 years back. And yeah, good questions, and we'll cover these and more. Okay, now there are only a couple of technical slides in this presentation. I'll try to go through them. I'd say even if you don't absorb all of this information, that's okay. But for some folks who've been exposed to this, I want to go through it a little bit. So basically, DNA inheritance goes something like this. So anybody, male, female, anybody can take an autosomal DNA test. These are the rather low-cost tests. You see them advertised on TV, Ancestry, 23andMe. These are available, and many, like way over 10 million people have taken tests like these. This is not what today's discussion is going to focus on, because it doesn't focus on the Reynolds line specifically, and these folks aren't in our project presently. Another type of DNA that's inherited from one's mother's line going all the way back is called mitochondrial DNA, and it is not as useful for genealogy, and we are not going to include discussion of that today. Final type of DNA that only males have, that they get from their fathers, and they get from their fathers, and they get from their fathers, going all the way back, is a Y chromosome, and that's YDNA. And this is what we're going to focus on today. Can somebody else tell me, what is it that a son inherits from their father, from their grandfather, from their great-grandfather, etc.? In addition to a Y chromosome, what usually travels down this line?
Surname.
Name, yes, the surname. So I got my surname from my father, my grandfather, etc. So surnames often travel with the Y chromosome. So that makes them very useful for testing within surname projects and within family name associations. Yes, John?
It is also the case, though, that a lot of times children are born and they get their mother's surname because their father was gone, or it was,
Yeah,
that type
be
of
in
thing.
the
So
picture.
that's why you have a change in surname.
That's right. Or it could be that the father dies or moves on,
They're
the mother
adopted
and the
or
younger children the mother gets remarried. The young children might take the stepfather's name, and then several generations later, it's not even remembered that there was this change. So that is part of the reason that all of your matches might not be Reynoldses, because these things do happen. Okay, just at a very high level, I'm going to cover a couple details about the types of YDNA testing that people can do. This is a diagram of a Y chromosome if it were all stretched out, and what this is showing here is the series of base pairs in a very specific slice of the Y chromosome. And one of the types of tests that somebody can do is called an STR test, and this test measures how many repeating segments of the same DNA happen in a very particular location. So scientists have identified this is a key location to count the number of repeated segments. And then they can test 3 males at this exact location to see how many repeats they have at this location. And for example, this man has 10 repeats, this man has 10 repeats, this man has 11 repeats at this location. And so they do this for 37 or 67 or 111 or 500 locations, and then based on how many differences between man A, man B, man C, they can say, look, out of 8 markers, the man A and man B only differ on 1 marker. So they are a little closer related than man B and man C, because out of 8 markers, they differ on 13 of these. So that's the basis of STR testing. And so what you can do over time, there's a common ancestor, and let's say they have 12 repeats at that location, and their lineage goes on with no changes in this lineage. But a different son has a mutation. That mutation is passed on sometimes. Sometimes there's a reverse mutation. On the other hand, there's a totally unrelated man over here who starts with 13 repeats in that location and passes on his 13 repeats over time. And now, if this man tests and this man tests, they would get a false positive conclusion that these men are closely related. Whereas this man and his brother, they would have a false negative. The results would say these men don't match each other, but in fact they do. The third thing is, there would be a false positive here because it looks like these men are closely related because they each have 12 repeats, but it's because they've had a back mutation. So with this type of STR testing, which is the most common, there is this limitation. It can give you, sometimes the results it gives you are a little can be misleading.
So are these mutations caused by infidelity? Is that what you're looking at?
Good question. No, they are completely random mutations in the DNA that are just part of how DNA is transferred. So the mutations, no, it has nothing to do with infidelity. It's just, the issue is this chromosome, it's one of the shortest chromosomes, but it's 60 million, it's a chain of 60 million letters long. If you run 60 million copies on the Xerox machine out there, they're not all going to turn out the same. And so there's a miscopy every once in a while, every few generations. that result in these changes. With the STR mutations, it could change one way, then a few generations later it might change back, etc. With this other type of marker, the likelihood of it ever reversing is basically 0. So, with a second type of Y chromosome test, instead of looking at repeats, it will look at a very specific place and it will find a single one-letter miscopy. What's key about this is that single one-letter miscopy is then passed on to every descendant of that miscopy. So if my third great-grandfather has a miscopy at this location, then that will be passed to all of his sons, all of his grandsons, all of his great-grandsons, all of his great-great-great-great. So this becomes the YDNA signature of that third great-grandfather. And so if we test any man on the planet for this exact mutation, out of the 60 million, we will know whether or not they descend from my third great-grandfather. So in a nutshell, STR testing, there are some limitations. SNP testing, you can have much higher confidence in the descendancy of coming from.
You said there's no miscopies?
In
that one marker?
In what I would have said is, what I should have said is, there are no reverse mutations. So if you ever get a case where what should be an A is miscopied to a G, I don't know the exact stats, but it is almost impossibly rare that this exact mutation would, some generations later, change back to an A.
I see.
Because out of the readable portion of the Y chromosome, this is unreadable on a consumer scale with present science. Same with the centromer, same with these things over here. So they look at these light blue sections because they can have high confidence reads. Out of the mutations that happen in these periods, in these areas, a mutation like this occurs about once every 3 generations. So if you get your results and you have 3 mutations differing from another person, you can estimate that you connect about 450 years ago, or 3 times the number of high confidence mutations that you have. Basically covered this, explaining that once a mutation happens, it is passed on indefinitely to all descendants of the man that had the mutation. Okay, so the Reynolds Surname Project, some very basic information. Our focus is on YDNA and on Reynolds Family Association traditions, like we talked about the progenitor chart earlier. A couple of the key project goals in the YDNA project are identifying genetic relationships between people that have tested. Those are the project members. The project, the administrators also organize the project members into groups or branches of the Reynolds family tree based on their genetic proximity to one another. And something we've been focusing on more recently is identifying the terminal SNP, or the YDNA signature of each of the RFA progenitors. We talked about that before. There are some other goals, but these are the ones that take the most of our focus. Okay, very basic information about the cost. One can have, so here are some STR tests that people can buy. You can start off with a 37 marker test. The cost of that is about $170. Family Tree DNA has sales about 4 times a year, and when they're on sale, you can get this test for about this cost. You can also get higher resolution STR tests, and these are good. These give you higher confidence than this will. I put a couple checks here, because these are the tests that the Reynolds family, the Reynolds project administrators recommend are the most useful. Really the most useful is this high-resolution Big Y test because it looks at all of your SNP markers. Those blue zones in the previous slide, it covers almost all of this region looking at SNPs. So this is really a useful high-resolution test. Some folks aren't willing to spend that on their genealogy. If so, we can put the member into a group with good confidence if they buy a test at this level. So if you're cost sensitive, you can come into the project with that at that cost. The last thing down here, this is kind of a specialized thing. As we are identifying the DNA signatures of the Reynolds line ancestors, we're not quite there yet, but we'll come to the point where new men can just test those specific SNPs and know whether or not they're connected. And those tests are very low cost. We've tried this out on my own line. Once we had identified my third great grandfather's signature, I tested my dad, who had never tested at all before. I tested whether he was positive for a couple of these key things, and he turned out to be positive. So we're testing this out on sort of larger scales as we go along too. Okay, a couple of things we want to explain what project members do and also what project administrators do. So as a member of the project, you would buy a test, you'd swab either yourself or maybe a cousin or brother or something like that. You receive the results. Family Tree DNA will tell you when they're done. You'll get a list of your matches and their email addresses. So you can send an email, say, I'm so-and-so, my lineage looks like this, how do you think we connect? Like people may be used to doing on Ancestry and other things. You can share trees and share your research. You can join projects within the Family Tree DNA database. Of course, we want you in the Reynolds project. If you have matches that are Taylors or McGillicuddy's or whatever, we also recommend you join their project. There's also something a little bit more obscure called haplogroups, and they look at sort of deeper ancestry information, and they do something different, which is that's something we could discuss, but it's a little bit beyond our focus here today. And you can identify strategies and cousins to test to advance your lineage. And you can also use your test results to validate ancestors that you think you may or might not descend from. Now, what the Reynolds Surname Project administrators do, so we're all unpaid volunteers. This is just something that we love to do. We establish the project goals and the things that we focus on. We establish join criteria. Some surname projects, they're absolutely open to anybody. There's no validation, there's no join request, just anybody can come in. We've set up a request system where people have to demonstrate their Reynolds connection. I think this is important also for the privacy of the data of the members in the group. If anybody can come in and join, it's less secure than if only related people can join. Administrators also answer testing questions, specifically about results, and we can advise members if they're considering upgrades or things like this. A lot of times, there's some variance in this, but a lot of times we don't get into the weeds of the specific traditional research of the participants. Just because, as you'll see, there are many distinct groups that all have deep history, and our focus is really on helping the members make use of their DNA results. So that's our comparative. So that's the end of this first section. What are your questions?
The the signatures, the letters and numbers that you had
Yes.
on, in red on the first
Yes.
or second screen there, how do
Yes.
they relate to the colorized charts and the typical charts in the Reynolds project?
Yes. In the project. So, you will see in the second segment, we will introduce in the second session,
Okay.
we'll introduce you to the project screen and we'll show what some of those things mean and we'll show where those SNP with the alphabet soup, we'll show you where that is visible and how to make use of that.
Blue light.
Yeah, good question. Other things for now? Okay, good, so why don't we do this? Let's see, our schedule, our plan was to have lunch at noon. So far we've covered one of 3 sessions. Why don't we go ahead and break for lunch as we had planned? After that, there's going to be we have more time to discuss this before the business meeting. So we can reconvene at 1:30 after the scheduled lunchtime, and I'll go through the final 2 prepared segments. In the meantime, for people that don't need the whole time for lunch, feel free to ask me questions. Nancy's available and ready to answer questions also. If you have sort of one-on-one things or want something more.